an analysis of practices of torture in the 17th and 18th century, specifically looking at these forms of discipline as a method for sovereign to express power, in other words, the state to exert power, and as a means to create fear in the public. Foucault defined punishment as a vital and key force in public society, such as the use of public chain gangs and physical and corporal displays of punishment in the 17th and 18th century. In terms of discipline, the disciplining of bodies and evolution of the bourgeoisie from the quote unquote idea of a docile body. And then we have this theory of the panopticon, which we're going to learn about. For Foucault, punishment, torture, and discipline, as well as the prison, played a key role in maintaining society. The panopticon is a theoretical concept designed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century. It was quote unquote a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind in a quantity hitherto without example, end quote. Michel Foucault's notion of the panopticon was in thinking through societal discipline as something that is produced through panopticism. The panopticon is polyvalent, meaning it has many different forms and multiple purposes in its applications. It serves to reform the prisoner, but also to treat patients, to instruct school children, to confine the insane, to supervise workers, to put beggars and idlers to work. It is a type of location of bodies in space of distribution of individuals in relation to one another, of hierarchical organization, of disposition of centers and channels of power, of definition of the instruments and modes of intervention of power, which can be implemented in hospitals, workshops, schools, prisons. Whenever one is dealing with a multiplicity of individuals on whom a task or a particular form of behavior must be imposed, the panopticon schema may be used. In other words, the form of carcerality and carceral networks are a critical part of the panopticon. When I say carcerality and carceral, we're talking about the prison, the carceral space of a prison. This is an image of the panopticon. As you can see in this image, 1 minute. In the image included in this slide, there is a large overarching structure that is full of windows on the ceiling, and it has many, many beams all at the center and surrounding it, kind of like a spider web, and all made of glass. It's a circle, and all around the circular wall, there are many different cells, all cells. And in the middle of the circle, there's a small structure that is open panels all throughout that can look and watch at every single point in the circle at all times. This is the panopticon. When we're talking about the panopticon, I find it very useful. I'll go back to this image for any Lord of the Rings fans or any fans of particular sci-fi films. There's many depictions of this in a lot of different types of films and comics, but it's also like Saruman's eye. The force in the middle is watching all Middle Earth at all times, but nobody can actually see the eye or look back at it. And this is what maintains power and structure in place. So the prison is a panopticon structure in itself. When we talk about the panopticon, we're really setting ourselves up to understand this contemporary notion of the prison industrial complex, the PIC. The prison industrial complex is a term to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as a solution to economic, social, and political problems. So, one thing that I really find incredibly useful is looking at the work of Critical Resistance, which are an organization founded in the early, I want to say about 30 plus years ago. And they have a definition for the prison industrial complex, which is a used to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems, as I read. Through its reach and impact, the prison industrial complex helps and maintains the authority of people who get their power through racial, economic, and other privileges. There are many ways this power is collected and maintained through the PIC, including creating mass media images that keep alive stereotypes of people of color, poor people, queer people, immigrants, youth, and other oppressed communities as criminal, delinquent, or deviant. The power or this power is also maintained by earning huge profits for private companies that deal with prisons and police forces, helping earn political gains for tough on crime politicians, increasing the influence of prison guard and police unions, and eliminating social and political dissent by oppressed communities that make demands for self determination and reorganization of power in the US. Abolition and the prison industrial complex abolition is a political vision with the goals of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. From where we are now, sometimes we can't really imagine what abolition is going to look like. Abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It's also about undoing the society we live in because the PIC both feeds on and maintains oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and controls millions of people. Because the PIC is not an isolated system, abolition is a broad strategy. An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us toward making our dreams real and that lead us all to believe that things really could be different. It means living the situation in our daily lives. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long term goal. And I really I encourage you to feel free to go back to this definition often. I find that critical resistance work is really helpful in providing clear and understanding notions of what we mean by these concepts that are very hard and large and encapsulate so many things, and it's easy to have a clear breakdown. So I encourage all of you to review um, that definition and to think through in your responses for this week, what is something that or what institutions and structures and ideas that you can think of, objects, etc., constitute the prison industrial complex in our daily lives. And it might be easy to think immediately right off the bat, like New Jersey is a very there's many detention facilities and prisons in New Jersey. But I want you to also, and I want to encourage you to also think outside of the physicality of the prison itself. But how may Rutgers benefit from systems like prison? What are the collaborations that happen between universities and prison systems, or prisons and hospitals, or prisons and schools, other forms of schools? What is the prison to school pipeline? So many ideas and thoughts that I want you to think about. So many different thoughts that I want you to think about for this section, but I really just encourage you to think about how the PIC is showing up in our daily lives. There's two main extra credit opportunities available. If you have access to watch Ava DuVernay's 13th film, I want you to respond to the following questions. What does DuVernay's film argue produces the modern US prison industrial complex, and what piece of legislation is rooted in this? Also think about what ways of thinking, discourses of power produce the rationale for the prison industrial complex. And what is the Southern strategy? What was the purpose of the war on crime? So I want you to think about all of this in your extra credit response post if you'd like to submit. These 2 extra credit are going to be 2 main opportunities this for the rest of the semester. And what these will do is they will add 3 points directly to your midterm exam or final exam. So all you have to do is write a 1-page response post, double space about your response to the film, as well as answering these questions. And this will be due by the end of the semester. But you can turn it in on a rolling basis if you would like to have those points added quickly to your grade. The second extra credit opportunity is reviewing the video by Just Mercy, Bryan Stevenson's work on A Story of Justice and Redemption. There's a lot of film portrayals of his work, a lot of videos, but I really want you to focus on this one, and I want you to answer these questions. How does Bryan Stevenson come to be an attorney and advocate for people on death row, and what was his journey? What type of place is Monroe County, country, Alabama? I want you to describe the population, the racial dynamics, the culture, and how does this shape how the criminal justice system operates there? I want you to describe the day-to-day challenges Bryan faced when he opened his own nonprofit law firm in 1989. And specifically, what type of work was he doing? What obstacles made his work even more difficult? And also name some of the discrepancies of Walter McMillan's case. What are the different ways in which the prison industrial complex and all its carceral networks shape how Walter's case moves through the system? For this response post, the same applies. It's a 1-page one-page response, double spaced, citing your sources, answering these questions, due on a rolling basis, but no later than the end of the semester, which will be pretty soon. The summer session goes by so quickly. Like I said, this adds 3 points directly to your final or midterm exam, and you can complete both for a total of 6 points, and you can split those points however you want. There are many activist approaches to social justice initiatives. The Equal Justice Initiative specifically is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, in terms of challenging racial and economic injustice and protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. So I want you to check out this organization to just learn about the work that they're doing. The Equal Justice Initiative was founded by Bryan Stevenson and is an example of the work that he has been developing for a long time. He also has a tech talk that I encourage you to check out if you have extra time, where he gives a really great summary and review of all the work he's done. Let's see here. Critical resistance, like I said, is great. I want you to review this resource as well. Feel free to go back to it. The second portion of this lecture for today is actually going to be from some of the work that I've done over the course of my my career. And I would like to share with you all because I think that there's a lot of similarities in the type of detention facilities that exist in the South Texas specifically, to the facilities that happen in New Jersey. So I love to share with everybody some of the work that people have done. And I know that many of you have different interests in law and organizing and feminism and so many things. And these are all great topics for you to think about pursuing as you continue with your career interests or job of interest, to think about what ways you could be part of these movements if you're interested. So Visions from the Inside is a series published from early 2015 to now, that is a organizing group based in Texas that led this campaign called the End Family Detention Campaign. In 2014, there was approximately about 60,000 children and mothers that fled from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to the US-Mexican border. At this time in South Texas, this received a lot of media coverage, but detention practices were taking place before this and continue to take place now. So one thing to note is the way that there's sort of media peaks when detention is happening. And this really became very prominent in the US political imaginary in 2014. At the time, many of the people who were migrating to the US were seeking refuge because of gang threats, domestic violence, child abuse in their countries, fearing being targeted due to their gender, sexuality, colonization. All of this has been caused by colonization from US imperialist forces that really have created this condition. And one of the things that's really important to emphasize is that a lot of people assume that detention and immigration captivity or imprisonment only impacts non-Black Latinx people, but this is very, very false. Like all other forms of policing and surveillance and captivity, they're meant to specifically target Black and Indigenous communities. Many of the people who are detained are from Indigenous communities, Garifuna, Afro-Indigenous communities based in Peru. There are many different groups and racial groups that are found in facilities, but often the representations that we see do not depict these stories because of the lack of support and anti-Blackness within the immigrant rights movement. In detention, immigrants are detained in prisons for months without access to bonds, or if they do have access, the bonds are incredibly high. And many have inability to be granted political asylum or any other form of immigration relief. At the time, one of the things that I wanted you to discuss is to think about why was the use of family detention being implemented when talking about facilities. And one of the reasons is because ICE works really hard to make these facilities palatable to the American public. The term family detention implies that immigrants are detained in family centers, but most often men, fathers, are relocated to other facilities and women or children are left alone. Many children are separated from their parents because they may have citizenship or their parents are undocumented. And some children are given to the care of their closest relatives, but many don't have access to this. And if they don't, they're placed in foster care services or deported back to their home countries. And this is particularly true of immigrant children from Mexico. At the time, this was a very common practice, but like I said, immigration law is very unique in terms of each country. So the conditions for somebody who is of Mexican descent may differ greatly from someone who is detained from Guatemala, El Salvador, Pakistan, or China. There are all of these very complex things that happen when somebody is detained that require relations with the consulate government. So, for example, if somebody is detained from Pakistan and we currently, the US, is not on speaking relations with the consulate, this means that ICE is not able to process any travel documents for them. So they can be detained in an ICE facility for years and years and years. Many people that I've worked with have been detained for that long, for many years, waiting for something to change, for their documents to be processed. And many of the people who are facing these long, indeterminate detention periods are typically Black, Indigenous men of color, and also other people who have either had some type of criminal conviction or charge. And this is why when we talk about abolition, we don't focus on these notions of innocence or nonviolence, but instead focusing on supporting all people, because no matter what anybody has done, nobody deserves engagement or captivity. The Visions from Inside series is a large publication that was published in 2016, and it included a series of different artists. In this image, there is depicted a woman who is maybe a bit older, 50 years old or so, and she's wearing a prison uniform. Her hands are visually in color, and she is putting her palms down on her lap. Her eyes are closed and her hair is pulled back, and there's a white tissue or rag or some type of white napkin in her hands, and she's clenching, but there's blood everywhere. Her outfit is tan and it matches the background, which is tan as well. She's wearing a white t-shirt, but her eyes are closed. And what's most depicted as like a photograph or that's depicted as most natural are her face and her hands and arms. Everything else lacks very much detail. And at the backdrop, there's a blue fence barbed wire with blood splatter. In the artist statement, the artist Fidencio Martinez states, "My practice examines the brown body, the battleground into which events, perceptions, and laws are formed. The Latino body has been the setting of exploitation, marginalization, and persecution. The manipulation of the painting surface and the act of physically cutting into paper or prints are metaphors for wounds, brands, and communal stereotypes imposed on quote unquote these people. And it causes the viewer to ask how long a group of people can withstand losing parts of themselves." So for your image reading response uh, for this week, I want you to just share your thoughts on these images. Share what you're thinking about. What does the artist statement speak to you? How is these works helpful for you to think about in terms of abolishing borders and undoing imperialism? The second image is from the Visions Inside lecture, and it's by artist Kristen Ramirez. It is a garment that is hanging on a thin barbed wire fence. It is bright with yellow, orange, blue, bright colors, and many, many symmetrical patterns and geographic shapes all around the textile thread that is hanging. It is got text on the side that says, "Think about what has happened. They sent me into the hole for defending someone." And on the other side, it says in Spanish, "Piensa usted de lo que me pasó. Me metieron al hoyo por defender a una persona." In the artist statement, Kristen Ramirez used gouache, watercolor, and ink on paper to create this piece that draws on vibrant color and pattern, using the huipil, the traje de vida, which is the name of this type of garment, as a metaphor. She draws comparisons between prison uniforms and this more humanized, dignified clothing worn ritually to events like weddings and burials. The huipil has historically been worn by people of high ranking, women in particular, and often used to adorn stains. It stands in as a reminder of the dignity that has been lost through irrational incarcerations. The following piece is the one that's depicted on our discussion post for this week. It's an image by Matisse Moore, and she states, "Christina's testimony about the cruel guards, the denial of hormones and basic medical treatment, and of having to hide her trans identity exemplified the ways our immigration laws and policies constantly oppress, dehumanize, and require an extraordinary degree of resilience, particularly from those who already face extreme marginalization within our cultures." Remember this: detention centers are for profit. Commissary, phone calls, free labor, beds, and food all create and generate revenue for the state. And we also pay for these facilities through our tax dollars. Childcare licensing facilities create loopholes on the law. In 2015, once a lot of organizers worked to shut down many of the facilities there, their response by many of the facilities in the Department of Corrections was to give them access to childcare licensing, which was a somewhat of a loophole to continue to run the facility. They are also continued to expand under the Trump administration, and currently there's a coalition in New York and New Jersey named the Abolish ICE Coalition that has done a lot of work to think about what detention facilities should look like under the Biden administration. And what they should look like is that they should not exist. So there's a lot of legislation and policies being put into motion to shut down these facilities, which is causing ICE to retaliate, and many hunger strikes are happening. If you're interested or would like to be more involved in this kind of organizing work, please feel free to reach out to me. There are organizations that we are building on all the time. There was an action last week at the Bergen ICE facility that was focusing on highlighting and supporting the hunger strikers at the facility at Bergen in Hackensack, New Jersey. And there's been many other actions happening at Essex, Orange County, the facility in Pennsylvania, Hudson, a facility in Queens, New York, Buffalo, Batavia, and Buffalo, New York. There's many different actions happening. And if you'd like to be more involved with this or want to know more about it, please feel free to reach out to me. I also want to highlight that we've engaged with some of this rhetoric before when we engaged with the earlier understandings of immigration. But one thing that I want you to note here is that a lot of times mainstream narratives around immigration enact violence when those stories are not included in the mainstream. The stories of directly impacted people who are detained, who have criminal convictions, all of that. Those initiatives need to focus those people so that everyone else can benefit. And I really want you to think about what are the possibilities that happen when we reframe this narrative to acknowledge criminality. We need narratives that consider 11 million immigrants, if not more, not just undocumented youth, dreamers who are biting to the good immigrant narrative. I want you to discuss finally in your response post, can you imagine a world without prisons? And if so, what does that look like? What does this world look like to you? And if not prisons, what alternatives could you imagine? In the new Jim Crow, we understand and engage with what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow. And at the time, you're going to be reading for this week that the new Jim Crow is defined as specifically a new time period in which incarceration and criminalization and surveillance are increasing. The original Jim Crow was a time period where there was a lot of laws and policies set into place and mandates that literally prohibited Black people from existing. Today, the new Jim Crow is an extension of the punitive carceral system, policing, and other aspects of surveillance, psychiatric hospitals, all of that. In the new Jim Crow, the author argues that what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. It is part of the era of colorblindness and post-racial administration, which was part of Trump's last speech. And it was the category of criminal, as we saw, as another way to not talk about race. And according to the author, the new Jim Crow is this a new period we're in of incarceration and mass incarceration. So for this week, I want you to focus on these two lectures, respond to the images that are available below. Feel free to peruse through the rest of the website. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Stay tuned for your grades for your midterm exam. Those will be posted no later than Wednesday this week. Thank you so much.